Hey, Becca here, and today on ALifeLearned I'm going to be talking about my experience with triggers and panic attacks, as well as offering some coping mechanisms to deal with these symptoms of PTSD.
Ideas are nearly as useful as what we do with them.
An idea could escape.
Ideas are bulletproof.
I'm making this video because the wonderful Nat Lopez actually asked me to do a video on my experiences with triggers and panic attacks, and as well as offering some tips in it as to how I deal with these things. And so to start off, I figured I should start by explaining what a trigger is, a traumatic trigger, and what a panic attack is. And so a traumatic trigger is basically an experience that someone goes through who has previously had a traumatic event, and this experience reminds them of that traumatic event. It triggers them back to the emotions and the feelings that happened during that time. And a panic attack tends to be what results from the trigger, not all the time, but oftentimes it does. It's also referred to as anxiety attacks, which is mostly what I experience, and that's when someone has a sudden feeling of fear or apprehension that tends to come on really suddenly. For some people it can last only a few minutes, and for others it can last up to hours. And it tends to be accompanied by bodily symptoms such as heart palpitation, dizziness, shortness of breath, or even feelings of unreality. Though thankfully, despite it sounding really awful to experience, and trust me, it is, it's apparently medically not that harmful physically to the body. It's just what a person can do when they're having a panic attack can get really harmful, of course. And in my particular experience, it hasn't ever really turned out to lead to any harmful situations, but it has been relatively traumatizing to be triggered and to experience these anxiety attacks. And that's one thing my therapist has talked to me about that's really important in learning how to cope with these symptoms, is that when you are triggered, you're basically being re-traumatized by something that already traumatized you before. So of course it's only making things worse, and really the best thing to do is to try to learn how to cope with it better and prevent it from happening as much as possible. Now, for me personally, I've had various different levels of triggers and anxiety attacks. Anxiety attacks tend to only result from the worst triggers. Personally, I've been just emotionally upset and sometimes just a little bit disturbed by things that reminded me of my past or reminded me of things that were upsetting, but I've also had times where I've outright burst into tears because someone was doing a motion that reminded me of my abuse, and I didn't even actively remember thinking back to the abuse, but my emotional response was very clear. I was bawling my eyes out because of what I had seen. And so that's an example of an emotional panic attack, and that is how people can respond differently. Your triggers can be of varying levels, and thus your responses can be of varying levels. And one thing to also note is, just because you have these triggers as a result of a traumatic event doesn't mean the triggers themselves actually have to be traumatic. I mean, a trigger is just a reminder, basically. It's reminding you back to that traumatic memory. So it can be something as simple as someone having the same haircut as your abuser sometimes, or someone having the same voice, or a smell. A lot of simple things can trigger a person even though they aren't in themselves a traumatic experience. And so for me, most of my triggers have been less panic attack related and more just about getting emotional and getting depressed, and then having to cope with that response to remembering the things I've been through and re-feeling the things I'd been through. Recently, I've actually been experiencing panic attacks a lot more because I have a lot of anxiety coming up for some things in life, but usually they're not that common. And no matter whether you do actually experience a full panic attack, anxiety attack, or whether it's just a minor trigger, the need to cope is still the same, because it's not okay to be in a triggered, heightened state. Either way, it really does affect your life and the way that you operate in it. And so it's really important to learn how to recognize your triggers and deal with them before they get too out of hand. Now, it's actually said that the best way to cope with triggers is to actually avoid whatever triggers you, but a lot of the times that's not really something you can do in life. I mean, again, if it's simple things like smells and sounds and sights that are very common and not really traumatic to other people, then other people are going to have them in life plenty, and you can't blame them for liking a color that triggers you. You can't blame them for having something that happens to trigger you, because that's your own personal experience with it. And so you need to deal with that experience and recognize what does trigger you, try to avoid it, and if you can't avoid it, try to learn how to bring yourself back down from that trigger and eventually learn how to cope with having it around. And once you get better and better at coping with these triggers, eventually sometimes they wean off to the point that they aren't triggers anymore. They don't upset you that much because you're able to bring yourself back so quickly it almost didn't happen. But that's honestly years and years down the road of therapy. It is possible. It takes time though, and work on coping. So many therapists will tell you that step one is actually to recognize when you're being triggered. A lot of people will get upset and they won't actually take the time to realize what's upsetting them, and so they'll end up getting upset by it again in the future, because in not recognizing what it was, they tend to expose themselves to it by accident again. So if you come to find yourself in a triggered state or a panic attack, if you're able, it's a really good idea to try and look around you and see what might be triggering you, what might be upsetting or reminding you of your traumatic experience. Or look into your thoughts and try to notice what you're thinking, what thoughts might have brought back these memories, maybe what environmental factors reminded you of these thoughts which brought back these memories. The idea being to try and see what around you has caused you to feel this state, so that, as I said, step one is avoiding, then you can avoid it by knowing what it is, or at least be more ready to deal with it triggering you once you've established that it is a trigger. Now, for some people, they actually find trying to figure out what the trigger is traumatic in itself, and so it's very important when you're trying to figure out what your trigger is that you have a safe plan for how to get yourself back to a stable state. Don't spend time trying to figure out your triggers if you don't have some kind of emotional support, someone that you can turn to if you get too far gone and need help coming back from your heightened state. Or at least some kind of coping mechanism that will help you calm down, because you of course don't want to get too far emotional, because that can of course get very dangerous. So once you've gotten to the point of recognizing some of these things that trigger you or that seem to remind you of things, it might help to write it down. Some people really find writing therapeutic. So write out what you're experiencing, what triggers you, and maybe not mentioning how it reminds you of things, but just noting the significance of how it emotionally impacts you will help you prepare better in the future and understand what's going on with you. But as I mentioned, sometimes we just can't avoid triggers. They do happen one way or another. So when you find yourself in a triggered state, if you're not sure how to cope with that, one thing to know about, one of the best things to know about, is a concept called mindfulness. And what this basically is just focusing on your breathing and doing breathing exercises in a somewhat meditative fashion. So to explain the basics of it, you just close your eyes so that you can focus on just what you're feeling, and then you breathe in as deeply as you can, focusing on the feeling of the air going into your mouth, down your throat, and into your lungs, filling them up. And then you exhale as deeply as you can. Again, focusing on the feeling of the air going out of your lungs and out of your throat. And the whole idea is to focus your entire mind on the feeling of breathing and the feeling of that fresh air going in and out, rather than the emotional state that you are currently in. Of course, this can be very difficult, especially when you're first trying it. You tend to have your mind wander very quickly, and so just try to notice when your mind wanders away from focusing on breathing and just calmly bring it back to focusing on just breathing. So again, close your eyes and just breathe in deep and then breathe out deep, and do this for as long as you need, so that you can focus on that and get your mind off of whatever memory and whatever feeling that got you into the triggered state. This is basically a form of what's called grounding, which is the idea of bringing yourself back to the present and back to the awareness that you're okay and you're safe right now and you're not in that traumatizing situation anymore. There are also other types of grounding methods, such as Focusing on smells, some people have little peppermint sticks that they'll have around that they'll use to bring themselves back to the present, or even physical objects such as rocks or soft objects, something to allow you to focus on something here and now and in the present rather than the past and that traumatic situation that you went through back then. I'm going to do videos in the future a lot more in depth about mindfulness, grounding, and self-soothing, which are all very important concepts for people who experience triggers and emotional upsets and who have PTSD symptoms. But just know the gist of it is focusing on your breathing. That's a really good way to start with mindfulness and to start with calming yourself down. And then, if you're able, find someone that you can talk to about what you're going through. I found that sometimes having someone to talk to when I'm in that upset emotional state, or someone to recognize that I'm in that emotional upset state, really helps me in coming down, because they can remind me to do the mindfulness exercises or the grounding exercises that I need to. And they can also just be a sounding board if I need to rant and be emotional about what I'm going through, but they can again remind me to not stay in that state of mind. And if that doesn't work for you, some people actually find people more triggering rather than less, then of course don't do it. It's just an option, as there are many different options and different ways that you can cope and ground and bring yourself back from a triggered state. And so with that in mind, I've actually left a link in the description offering different coping mechanisms for triggered. I highly advise that you check it out if you're having issues with this problem. And if you have any possible coping mechanisms that I didn't mention that you found really helpful in getting yourself out of triggered states, please share them in the comments below. I'm sure anyone going through the very unfortunate experience of triggers would appreciate as many suggestions as possible, because we're all unique, and so being able to try a lot of different things is really nice, and being able to find what works for you. Just never forget that you're not alone in this. There are lots of people out there going through these experiences who also care that you're going through this and want to help. I'm one of those people, and I'm always here if you ever need someone to message. Feel free to message me through the YouTube message chat thingy, and feel free to send me a message about a video request if you'd like to know any more about the concepts I've mentioned today, or anything else PTSD or mental health related. I'm more than happy to take video requests. So anyway, I hope you found some help in the tips I offered. Thank you so much for watching, and please join me again next week where I try again to share a little something I've learned in life.